Good evening. Welcome to tonight's meeting of Bethlehem City Council Committee of the Whole, Wednesday, May 22nd, here at 6 p.m. in Town Hall to review the city pension funds. If the clerk would please call the roll.
Mr. Callahan?
Present.
Mr. Cologne?
Present.
Mr. Martell?
Present.
Ms. Negron? Mr. Reynolds?
Present.
Dr. Van Wert?
Present.
Mr. Waldron?
Present. We have one agenda item this evening to review city pension funds. This meeting is for informational purposes only, and we will not be taking any votes this evening. Tonight's meeting format is as follows. Eric Evans, the city's business administrator, will open the presentation, followed by pension consultant Frank Burnett of Morrison Fiduciary Advisors will then make a presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, I will recognize members of council for comments or questions. Then I'll recognize the administration for any comments or follow-up questions. After that, I will recognize the public for comment with a 5-minute time limit. We have no names signed up on the sheet, so I will open it up to the floor then. And at this time, I will introduce Eric Evans to start the presentation.
Thank you, President Waldron. Thank you, Council, for bringing this committee together this evening. This idea of talking about pension really is a follow-up to our budget hearings last fall, sometime late last summer when we began to put the budget together, and the pension numbers and calculations that are put together every other year led us to a startling understanding that the pensions continue to grow at a rate that is very tough to sustain. So we did feel that we wanted to take a step back and share with council an overview at times, and also a little bit later, maybe we'll go in the weeds a little bit about what they are, what we've seen, how we've been dealing with it, and we'll get done on a monthly basis. That leads us to those numbers that you see every fall. So I have a couple of slides. I don't know if you can see them from there. I'll refer to them a little bit. It's not a lot. Most of the night we'll be spending on the handout that was prepared and given to you by Frank Burnett. Frank Burnett is with us this evening. He's a principal and senior consultant from Morrison Fiduciary Advisors, and he is here in the audience with us. So if I put the next slide up, Mark Sivak, the Director of Budget Finance, will also have some items and some comments, as well as our elected controller for the city of Bethlehem, Mr. George Yasso, is with us, and we'll also share some of his thoughts about pensions. If you look at the slide above you, there are 3 pension funds in place, 3 pension programs: police, fire, and the PMRS. They are in some ways similar, but in some ways different. All 3 are what we call defined benefit, and that's different from a defined contribution plan like a 401k. A defined contribution plan is when the employee makes a contribution, the employer will offer a match. The money is placed into some type of funds. The funds grow, and at the end of the day, that amount will grow towards retirement. In a defined benefit program, it is different. The employee makes a contribution, and at the end of the day is promised amount. There's a benefit at the end. It's defined, it's promised, it's earned, it's contractual. And if you look at the police up top, also I kept this the general just to give you an idea of what happens here. Police make prior to 2012, police made a contribution. 7% of the gross pay goes into the pension. You will see that in the second column, up until 2012, if you're a policeman and you served 20 years, you would retire and then able to start collecting your pension, 60%. There's a plus. That means that 60% plus overtime, longevity, roster duty, and the items that may be in that. So it's actually higher than what your base salary would be. And it ratchets up at maxing out at 25 years. If you have 25 years served as a policeman prior to 12, you would have earned a pension that would pay 70%. You'll see that there's no minimum retirement age, which means if you start at age 30 and you work your 25 years, right, that makes you 55, and then you can begin collecting at retirement. There's also an automatic surviving spouse. If something happens to you, 50s into your something happens, your surviving spouse would then be able to pick up the difference of that throughout their lifetime, he or she. I guess I would say that the next column, you'll see there's the post 2012. In the year 2012, it was a result of fire arbitration that resulted in some changes in the contracts and the way the pensions were offered and calculated. And after that arbitration award, the police settled, and PMRS, when they went through their regular negotiations and settled their contracts, also made some changes to dial back a little back of what the pensions are. So since 2012, if you'll see, staying with the police, you now can only earn up to 50% of your salary, and it's your base salary plus longevity. It's not, if you earn overtime and roster duty, you can do that, but it doesn't go towards your pension. And if you work 25 years, it's 50%. If you work 30 or 35 or 40 years, it's that 50% number. So it's not the 70%, but that's anyone that started since 2012. So in some time down the road, we'll begin to see the fruits of those changes. Right now, it's still spiking for us, but we know, but just by looking at the mathematics involved, that there will be some relief. Fire is very similar. If you look at the fire, they contribute 8% of the pay. Their earnings were very similar. They get 60 if they make 20 years, you get 60%, up to 70% plus pre-2012. Post 2012, it's at that 50% of the salaries when they retire. They can begin taking it to any age, and they have the automatic surviving spouse benefit. PMRS plan is not as rich. The contribution is 7.5%. They do have minimum retirement age. That's for the non-uniformed pension programs. So you need to start, if you are an employee for the City of Bethlehem and you start before 2012, you can start taking your pension at age 55. Those that start after 2012 need to wait till 62. So they do have a minimum age requirement, so it begins. And they earn 2% times number of years. So if you work those 20 years, you don't get the 60%, you will get the 40%. If you work 40 years, we have some employees that reach 40 years of service, they can reach as high as 80% of their salary. That's a maximum number pre-2012. Post, there was also a change to that as well. The minimum age went up, and now 65% is the max. It's 2%. So in a typical career that might last 20 years here at the city would be 40% of your last couple of years of your salary. So that's what the pensions are offered to the employees. This is something that we're all familiar with at budget time. It's a growing number. It's a little startling when you go back to 2004, which has now been 15 years. In some ways, it seems not so long ago. And we look back to 2004, the MMO was $1.4 million. And it's grown through time. There's been some leaps and bounds along the way, some adjustments based on market conditions. And in this past year, at the bottom, you'll see in 2019, the pension cost to the city increased nearly $2.2 million. Pension, the MMO is now over $14.6 million a year to meet those obligations. So we're able to make those payments. And it now accounts for 18% of the city's $78 million budget. So it's a significant expense. The payment we make annually is referred to the MMO, the minimum municipal obligation. The calculation includes, there's several variables in this, as in the number of employees enrolled in the system, in the program, the contribution rates, their age, the mortality tables that are run, and the performance of the pension funds. When the contributions are made, they're moved into funds. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and Frank's going to have an opportunity to talk to you about how we manage the funds and his role in that place. But a significant share of the MMO increase that we saw this past year in 2019 was a stock performance in 15 and 16. So a point I want to make is that the valuations we use in the calculation for pensions are actually delayed. And they're based upon the pension fund balance is at 1/1/17. So when Mark starts to work to deliver and make those calculations, there is a delay. It wasn't that at the end of 18, 12/31/18 is our 19 payment. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Updates and mortality tables, how long people are living in the program also drive significant change to the MMO. Third and last point about the MMO, which you see in the budget book, is that the next valuation was made on 1/1/19. And unfortunately, the market, as we all probably remember, performed very poorly in the fourth quarter of 2018. The market did rebound quickly in 2019. It made up for the losses, and we were back on track where we might hope and expect to be. But the fact of valuation, that picture is taken at 1/1/19, means the next valuation will have that little dip in it. And as a result, the MMO might be higher than what we would hope it to be if it would have been a 131 picture. The next thing about the pensions is the pension boards. There are a couple of pension boards that manage the funds. The police and fire pension fund are each managed by a board. Each board is made up of the mayor, the business administrator, the controller, the treasurer, and 3 representatives from the member group. So the police fire pension board has 7 members. The fire pension board has 7 members. The aggregate board is a combination of those boards, the 4 standing and the 3 from each fire and police. So those 10 people make investment decisions as a unit. The board's meetings are chaired by the mayor, and the boards meet monthly. The boards, in order to make the decisions, employ the services of an expert and independent investment advisor. At this time, I'd like to turn to our controller, Mr. George Yasso, to talk about our investment advisor and some of the decisions that are involved.
So first of all, congratulations to Mr. Cologne, Mr. Reynolds, and Dr. Van Wert. So we're here to talk about the pension fund, and as Mr. Evans referred to, Frank Burnett through Morrison Fiduciary Advisors is our independent investment advisor. When I started on the pension board in 2015, coming from a background of retirement planning, I was kind of apprehensive as to how this pension board would be handled. And I was pleasantly surprised after meeting Frank and after seeing the process and how sophisticated it was. When you employ someone for a professional service, I think one of the biggest things you want to look for is you want someone that is highly specialized. And with Morrison Fiduciary, they're exactly what we were looking for. They have about 80% of their focus is on Pennsylvania municipalities. They have about $2 billion in client assets, and that's over just 20 clients. So with them having that type of concentration, allows for them to give us the number one, the type of access to the top vendors there are around, and number two, get the attention that these pension funds deserve. So I'm not going to take up much of your time because I think this is long overdue for you guys to be able to talk to Frank and get your questions to him. But I think I encourage you to ask him any questions, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the answers that you'll get. So I will turn it over to him, or we turn it over to you. All right.
That's quite an introduction. I've been introduced before, but that's very nice of you, gentlemen. My name is Frank Burnett. I introduced myself to you. We've actually amazingly been working with the city of Bethlehem for 15 years. And, I'll tell you a little bit about our firm just so you know who's actually doing the work and so forth. But I'm going to explain the process. A lot of people look at their own personal investments or their church investments, however, their parents' money and so forth. And they look at it and they say, our real goal here is we don't want to lose money. Okay. So they do CD investments, and as long as the value is staying kind of what they started with, if they started with $300,000 and somehow it's still at $300,000, and they take a little bit of money out to buy a car or pay some rent or so forth. But if they manage to stay at $300,000, they think they're successful. But in this pension world for the city of Bethlehem, that'd be total failure. If I go back 10 years, I think the fund was $74 million, and now it's $160 million. Meanwhile, the liabilities to the retirees on a projected basis, it might have been, 60, 75, 80 million at one point. Now it might be over $175 million in liabilities. You have to grow the money to be successful in meeting the obligations of your employees. And you have to be successful at growing the money. And at the same time, you need to be paying out benefits to the retirees. So the investment process for a pension plan is a lot different than how you folks might approach your own investments. And that process is something I'm going to explain to you. But in terms of my background and so forth, I went to Lehigh University, spent some time up at JP Morgan, back to Pittsburgh where I grew up with Mellon Bank. I was with a firm called RRZ Investment Management, which was a big municipal underwriting outfit. We also did a lot of pension plans. I was president of the pension group. And back in 2002, I broke out on my own, and City of Bethlehem was one of our early accounts. So our firm is not big, but we're affiliated with Wilshire Investments, Wilshire Consulting, which is a big national caliber firm. They literally have trillions of dollars in assets. I think down here they do Verizon's pension plan, and they do the state of Pennsylvania plan and so forth. And we have the benefit of all their research and all their services and all their technical and academic research that helps us come out here and plot a path of investments for the city that's embedded in a proper process. Second thing about our firm I think is important, and with any type you're getting investments, and I mean this is something that applies to individuals. We are an advisor, so we advise the city. We do not have any broker-dealer relationships. We do not have any money management services. We do not have any custody service, any invoice, any administrative services. So when we walk in the door, it's almost like Jack Spurk when he walks in here. He's your solicitor, and he's not working for any of the vendors that are approaching the city. So it's really important that separation be respected. And as we serve the city, we actually serve the city as a fiduciary, a full-blooded, legally responsible fiduciary, which means any recommendation we make to the city has to be in the best possible interest of the city. So with personal investments, people can come in and say, well, I think this mutual fund's good enough, and as long as I make a commission on it, I'm happy and you're happy. It has to be just suitable. But in this business, as a fiduciary, you have to be the best possible solution at all times. And the board we talk about, this combined board that manages us as we oversee this thing, where we have police, we have fire, we have non-uniform, we have the controller, the treasurer, the mayor, the finance director, other people sit in, the deputy controller, and Mark sit in and participate. So in that capacity, they are all governed by the same fiduciary rule. And so they have to conduct themselves with the highest standard and always acting in the best interest of the city. State law and federal law, there's no political contributions permitted by any of the vendors that serve the pension plan, the advisor, or any of the money managers or service providers. So I just want to probably, maybe as important as anything, to establish the credibility of what the pension board does is it operates under an investment policy statement that embeds in it all these standards of care and fiduciary best practices. So you folks can sit back and kind of let this thing run its course, knowing that that very high level of standard has been established. Okay? At any time in this, feel free to stop and ask a question, because normally these things are very conversational and people do have their own opinions about investments and they're dying to ask that type of thing. I'm not real good on crystal balling and tell you what the market's going to do over the next 3 months. And I usually don't give stock tips, but most everything else is considered fair game. Any questions at this point? Okay, if you want to just look at the book here that I handed out, I shouldn't call it a book, it's a short piece. I would spend a little time talking about the economic scenario, but I can tell you as long as I've been in the business since 1980, the economic model has won. Okay, so with all the challenges and all the recessions and all the foreign exchange problems and all the Democrats versus Republicans versus taxes versus, all the stuff that goes on, capitalism and corporations, which is basically what these investments are. You have to believe in corporations, have the ability to manage and adjust their business affairs such they can make a profit. And as long as I've been alive, and I even in high school and stuff, I followed stocks for 40 years, the corporations have prevailed by having higher revenues, higher sales, higher profits. And so all we've ever done with this thing is participate in state investment, thinking the long term. Long term is certainly 3 to 5 years, probably 5 to 10 years. In reality, with the liability of these plans, it's 10, 20, 30-year timeframes. It's very important that we not get bogged down or confused by short-term dynamics, because if that was the case, we would spend every meeting talking about what's going to kill us. And we always look back a meeting or two, and it never did. So the governor, all these institutional pension plans with all these high price advisors, they force their clients to stay as far visioned downfield as possible. And at this point, it's paid off pretty well. So the economic summary basically says that model is intact. Things aren't overpriced. Right now stocks are trading at a 16 times multiple. You hear the people talk about the PE. That means stocks are selling at about a 6% yield if you take their earnings divided by their share prices, and they're growing at about 10% a year. So in the pension fund, we're trying to generate a return of 7.5%. And if stocks start off at a 6% yield and grow 10% a year, that's going to produce that actual rate of return. And so that's what we do every meeting. We start off when we review the economics and somewhat confirm that we should have 50, 60, 70% of the money invested in risk-on stock-like assets. So we usually go through a couple pages of charts and so forth. And if I got questions on the economy, I could refer to those. But if I could take you over to page 8, that's my general comments on the fund. As of March 31 of this year, the combined pension funds are $153 million. If you go all the way back to 2009, which happens to be the last time we had a market downturn about 10 or 11 years ago, they were only $87 million. And during that time period, we've paid out enormous amounts of benefits and still appreciated the fund by that amount. During that 10-year time period, net cash flows, which is the gains and income produced by the fund, was actually about $66.5 million. And the annualized returns, and that's like, we've had a lot of things go wrong temporarily over the last 10 years, but the annualized rate of return over that 10-year period is actually 10.03%. Which I think is really outstanding. Obviously, that's been a very strong time period, but over all kind of time periods, the fund has generated returns equal to the actuarial assumed rate of return. We're currently invested, let me just, before I go into this third bullet point, the biggest thing we really train our clients that it's okay to take some risk in the portfolio, but as a trustee and a fiduciary, your best friend in doing this is to get as diversified as you can possibly be. So in this particular fund, we have 10 different investment styles. Most people are used to large cap stocks, small cap stocks, maybe foreign stocks and fixed income. They maybe get the 4 asset classes, but we have real estate. We have so many other asset classes, which I'll point out later, but we have them broken out 10 different ways. So it's almost like a 10-cylinder engine. You can have a couple cylinders not firing well, but if the other 8 are doing well, then the whole engine still runs fairly smoothly. And they're designed such that maybe in bad equity markets, these couple asset classes don't do so well, but there's other asset classes that actually do fairly well when the equity markets aren't doing well. So they tend to offset each other and balance out the returns. Right now, we're about 59% equities, 26% fixed income, and we're about 15% in what is known as alternatives, which I'll talk to in a minute. But alternative investments are, the trend now is to minimize publicly traded equity as an exposure. And the exposure you do have in publicly traded equities takes a lot of indexing and low fees. And then they're basically adding into the portfolio's alternate investments, which is primarily for us is made up of real estate. It's made up of private equity, middle market buyouts, not venture capital. And second of all, it's debt of private equity companies. No hedge funds, no natural resources. Those asset classes we don't use. And at this point, I mentioned in here, there is a funded ratio of the fund that's somewhere around 75%. That changes from time to time, but that's about where we stand right now. On page 9, just a little graph, because people love graphs, but if you go back to June of 2009, that's where the fund was 90 million. We end up today about 155 million. There's a lot of zigs and zags in here, and a lot of pension board meetings, and a lot of emails, and a lot of questions and consternation in meetings with the managers, which I'll identify in a minute, who are serving the fund, the actual people who pick the stocks and pick the bonds and buy the real estate and so forth. But at the end of the day, we've kind of rationalized and felt comfortable with this type of volatility and risk such that we can get returns that exceed that actual rate of return. And of course, you understand that if we get that actual rate of return or better, the annual cost to the city is lower. But anytime if this fund was not meeting that 7.5% actual rate of return, let's say it was just meeting a 5% return, well, the difference between 5 and 7.5 ends up coming to you every budget time in an additional required contribution. So I know sometimes people will look at this and say, boy, that's a pretty aggressive portfolio and it has some risky assets and so forth. You have to take risk, diversified, balanced, measured, intelligently investigated and so forth. But that's the only way you can get the type of returns that makes the pension plan affordable for the city. Okay. And that's a tried and proven method. I mean, like I say, Wilshire has trillions of client assets. They all invest kind of along this model. It adjusts from year to year. It morphs a little bit. But at the end of the day, the idea of just picking a lot of treasury notes and some short-term CDs and thinking that that's going to be enough to do the job, that would be almost unaffordable for the city. Okay. So let's flip over to the next page, which is page 10. And again, if I'm going too fast or you have a question, please. On page 10 is the actual mix of the asset allocation. So we have the name of the investment manager on the far left, the actual performance benchmark that they're measured in the second column, the actual dollar amount that's assigned to them, the percentage of that dollar amount relative to the total fund, and then target allocation is from our investment policy that the board approves at our suggestion. Basically comes down from the institute, or the industry kind of comes up with what is a good practice. And the board determines that in the long term, thinking 10 years, this is the asset mix we're going to have in the fund, which is 22% large cap, 12% small cap, 14% international. That adds up to 48% equities. And then the fixed account, our goal is 30. We currently are underweighted in fixed where the returns are atrocious. And then in alternates, we have a goal of 22. And at this point, we're invested 18% in alternates. You're allowed to have a range within that target. I have the range and then the over-unders and so forth. And this is something we do every month at our firm. Every quarter, we review with the board. There's a strategic overlay to this. Like right now, we are overweighted equities and underweighted fixed incomes. We think that will add some value to you, but we're always tethered to that long-term 10-year policy benchmark. Okay, flip to page 11 and 12. A lot of this is not under your control. So really what a board does is they conduct themselves with a very appropriate, very diligent fiduciary process. And if you do all these steps, we have a 15-page policy statement that outlines who does what and what happens if a manager is underperforming and what the board's responsibilities are and what the mayor's and the business administrator's job is, what the consultant's job is. Everyone has a role. We use Philadelphia, by the way, we use Philadelphia Trust as the custodian. So all of the pension fund assets are held at a bank, locked up in a vault, and the money, Philadelphia Trust can move the money from one manager to another manager, but they need the mayor's office and the administrative office to approve that. So we make a recommendation, the mayor's office approves that, and only then will Philadelphia Trust move money, and they will only move money to pay a retiree check, a vendor invoice, or between managers. So you try to keep all the money in one place, lock the key, and it just moves around inside the vault. It doesn't go from this firm to that firm, back to the city, back to me. It's all locked up tight as possibly can be. So at the end of the day, you do end up with investment returns, and we calculate those returns on a monthly and quarterly basis, and we give the board this 2-page sheet called the performance summary table. And in the first section, I have the total fund. So this is the $153 million fund. And the total return on the first line is the returns annualized over that time period. So obviously, year to date, the fund's doing pretty well. It's up about 10%, 9.92 to be exact. The 1-year return with the fourth quarter wasn't really good. So the 1-year return is 4.88. But the 2-year return, 7-year return, the 10-year return are all very, very good returns. And then you compare that to that policy index I mentioned that's part of our investment policy statement. So you take the returns of those various asset classes by the weighting, that percentage weighting, and you blend all that together, and you said if we had an index return in every one of those asset classes and we had it in exactly what the policy mix, the return would have been the policy index. And you can make comparisons between what the Bethlehem City Pension Fund returned and what the policy index said you could or should have returned. And just, it's a very competitive world. Meeting indexes and beating indexes are hard to do. In any fund at this size and this level of complexity, if you're keeping up with the indexes, that's considered to be very good. The lagging performance is a problem. And then what you do is you go through and you look at the individual managers. So we use Philadelphia Trust for equities and some fixed income. We use Vanguard for indexing. We use a firm called Twin Capital for enhanced indexing. We use Eagle Asset for small cap. We use a firm DFA and Vanguard for international. Our fixed income managers are Agincourt and Philadelphia Trust. Our real estate manager is Bentel Kennedy. We've had them for about 10 years. Notice their returns since inception all the way over to the right-hand side. I'm on page 12, the third manager down. That's a real estate investment. The return there has been 9.33%. We started a new real estate manager, Boyd Watterson, that invests in state buildings leased by state and federal governments. That's called Boyd Watterson. And then we have, over the last 4 or 5 years, we started adding in some private equity and private debt. So we've done that with Hamilton Lane, Neuberger Berman, and Adams Street Capital. And those returns are short-term. We haven't had these things for very long, but they've had a really nice return. The Hamilton Lane, that one where there's a negative return, we've only had that for about a year, and they've had some expenses and so forth. So that's a little bit of an anomaly. And that's not even remotely fully invested. But the returns in pretty much all the asset classes are competitive with the index returns and competitive and behaving pretty much exactly like what we had expected as we projected them. Every now and then you get a manager. You can't have 10 different managers or 12 different managers and not have someone underperforming. If you want to just not take any risk of underperforming, you can't put managers in a position to outperform. So the fact that most of our managers are outperforming is great. The fact that occasionally you'll have a manager that's underperforming, that's normal. Underperforming managers, great managers go through periods of underperformance and they kind of turn around and they come back. So at any given time, the fund and the pension board is looking at these returns on a quarterly basis. And when a manager starts to trail their benchmark over a period of time, they go on what's called watch. Once they're on watch, they're an agenda item at every quarterly meeting. They're invited to come in and explain themselves. We set goals for improvement. And we really try to stick with managers as long as we can, because over long periods of time, they tend to do pretty well. But occasionally, and every couple of years, we do have to terminate a manager based on performance, and we do so. and the board, we go out and we find and pick another manager. In the pension fund, we can pick mutual funds without a publicly offered RFP, but any money manager that has a contract that gets a check paid from the pension fund, it is required to be RFP'd through Pennsylvania Act 44. So most of the vendors, I would say at least half, if not 3/4 of the vendors that are on this, probably 3/4 of the vendors resulted from some sort of an RFP process, national caliber. There are very few local managers. Philadelphia Trust would be the only one, and they're from Philadelphia. We have no third-party payments. We have no local investment personnel taking a piece of the cut or a piece of the revenue. There's no local representation. The pension board enjoys a direct relationship with every manager in the fund, and there's no middleman or local guys or any of that involved. That's kind of by standard and by practice. And then the other thing we do, which I think I'm fairly proud of, is we do on the last page, page 13, we go into I certainly every year and more frequently as necessary, we track every manager and we take a look at the fees they charge and the basis points, and we deem them to be reasonable or unreasonable for that matter, but we're always believing that we're current with fee schedules. About every 3 or 4 years, I have the mayor sign a letter. We send it to all the vendors, something to the effect, the pension fund has grown, the assets have grown, the fees have grown. We'd like to consider a fee schedule cut or a negotiation. We always get a little something back, so these schedules are always being updated. And at the end of the day, the total investment management fees in this fund are about 41 basis points. And that's embedded in a mutual fund fee, or if that's a commission they pay, or if that is a invoice that they bill us and we pay every quarter. So that's every hidden and unhidden fee associated with the asset manager of the fund. That hits 41 basis points. And then your administrative costs, which is the custodian, issuing the checks to the retirees, the actuary who does this work for you every 2 years and every year gives us data, and then this investment consultant, Morrison Fiduciary Advisors, we run that out, and that ends up being 13 basis points, and 100 basis points is a percent, so 43 basis points is 43/100%. And you get to the end, and we're running the entire fund at 64 basis points, which I think is very competitive. I see a lot of funds at 80 and 90 and 100 and 125. I was just down to one of the municipalities that are running money at 110 basis points here in the Valley. So we're quite proud that 64 basis points is competitive. And every now and then I get the chance to look at some of the other counties down here or around. We have 6 Pennsylvania counties, and this is a very good low price. So that's the information that we go through on a quarterly basis. Some of it we do more on an annual basis, but we meet for about an hour every quarter. And if I need to get on the phone or come down here for special meetings, they are the first Friday of every month at 9:30 in the mayor's conference room, and they're open meetings. So if anyone from the pension board wanted to, take a little more interest, or anyone from council that wanted to take a little more interest in this, you're welcome to come in. We get people stopping in and observing the meetings, and they don't stay a long time because they see the process is credible and it's reliable, and they have confidence in it. But it is an open meeting, and I'd invite council to sit in anytime they wanted to. So if there's any questions or comments, or be glad to field them.
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for making the trip out here to spend the evening with us and give us this background information. I had a few points I wanted to touch on before I open it up to the rest of council. And I don't know if this is maybe a better question for you or the administration, to whoever it lands on, if you could hit it. Mr. Evans talked a lot about the pre-2012 and post-2012. Obviously, there was some kind of negotiation there. I wasn't on council at the time, so can you walk us back through there and what that process was like to get those more favorable numbers for the city?
Sure, I'll take that one. So as Mr. Evans said, for police and fire, hires after 2012 have a different level of benefit. It all kind of began with the firefighters. We were in arbitration with them, and that was something that the city got through arbitration And based on that arbitration decision, then the police union negotiated the same changes. And I think we mentioned it at budget time, but those post 2012 benefits are the minimum required by the state. So that's the minimum that you have to offer police and firefighters. And as Mr. Evans said, one of the big cost drivers in that is the fact that surviving spouses automatically get 100% surviving benefit. Whereas with PMRS, if you want your spouse to have a benefit, yours gets actuarially reduced, based on age and things like that. So
Right.
that's a huge cost driver. But that's how those changes came to be. And then, as you said, when we negotiated with SEIU, after that, they accepted those changes as well.
Understood. And just to clarify, that 2012 date, that's your start date, not the retirement date.
Correct. You start as an employee.
Understood. And I guess the next question would be for Mr. Barnett. We hear a lot and get a lot of headline press about underfunded pension and what that percentage looks like. I know that the city has always had a pretty favorable amount. I think you said it was around 75%. Can you talk a little bit about that unfunded amount and how that relates to what the city is doing and what the work that you're doing?
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, it's a battle because you saw how the assets have grown, but the liabilities have even grown faster.
Right.
What sometimes people don't realize, you think you're not awarding a lot of pay increases, but you're occasionally adding a couple more employees. And then sometimes you'll take employees and they get promoted or they become, you break 2 units up and now there's 2 unit heads. And I'm not sure what all the mechanics are, but amazingly, the total payroll cost historically goes up a lot more than inflation. And that's why those liabilities grow. You don't really realize it when you're doing it because they're all like small impacts. But I remember seeing your report, and historically, you folks have had an increased payroll cost and therefore obviously an increased pension liability, which goes hand in hand. It's been like 3.5% a year or maybe even 4.5% a year. And that seems like an incredible number. And the actuary says, well, listen, here's the data. He just shows you your payrolls for 10 years that he's been calculating for you. And lo and behold, there's the data. So I think pension fund deficits are a nightmare. And up in Harrisburg, they've made all kinds of mistakes. Investment performance has been a glaring one, which they never admit to or even acknowledge. But some of the stuff that's gone up there is just obvious. So we have state treasurers in prison right now for it. So, that has been a downturn. They've awarded a lot of benefits without really acknowledging the actual liability. And then the worst thing is when the actuary comes in and says, hey, Mr. State of Pennsylvania, guess what? Your liabilities have gone up. You need to put in $128 million. The legislator goes, not this year. Okay. So in the city of Bethlehem, and this is the discipline that's always been in place and will continue to be in place, whatever that actuary tells you to put in, the city puts it in. Okay. You're always gaining on fully funded status. And just to be really general, you're kind of funding that liability on like a 10-year amortization. And if you could somehow hold everything else still and just make those required payments for 10 years, you'd get caught up. But but then you have a contract and then you have a bad quarter in 2018, or you might have a good quarter in 2019. There's just so many moving parts that you're always trying to get caught up on like a 10-year amortization. But I think that successful 100% funded status exists because the city apparently can afford to make the required contributions. Obviously, state aid helps a lot, but the difference between what state aid pays and what the actuary asks you to pay is a number that you can get into your budget successfully. And, the returns are pretty good. You're as clever as you can be on negotiations and keeping your labor costs in check. And I think as long as you can afford to do it and you're on this 10-year AM, then you're doing your job. If you saw the fund falling apart and you're missing payments, everyone's got to throw up a lot of red flags because it's a very slippery slope. Once you get down to 60, 50, 40% funded, you just can't do it.
Right.
So it's a scary thing. It's probably the biggest moving part in the city's budget over the next 10 years is how these pension funds are going to do and what those liabilities are going to do. But, I've been here 15 years. You've always made the payment. You've always been making progress on it. And I think what you're doing is the right thing. You can always get all wound up and try to do more, but it's too hard to do more. You just do exactly what that actuary tells you to do and make sure you have room in your budget to do it.
Right. And as council, we don't really have a role in how that money gets invested. But I mean, one thing that this council has done really to support the administration is keep an eye on that headcount number of not adding people on, because that's a 25, 30-year commitment down the line to pay that pension, because just that little amount really is multiplied exponentially.
Yes, I cannot, I mean, the pension liability is a very big portion of contributions. And like they say, you calculate the pension as a percentage of the final 3 years. So you might hire a guy at base salary and you think, oh, that's not expensive. And then, 8 years into it, he's a senior, and 8 more years into it, and then next thing you know, he's in Mark's position or Eric's position. Now you're taking.
They do get paid too much, you're right.
Well, you just get your, my point is, in the first 10 or 20 years of a guy's career, you're funding for a smaller salary. And then toward the end of the career, when they get bumped into senior positions, that's when you calculate what the pension benefit is.
Yeah, not their $7,100 they make as a council member, unfortunately.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the next question. But
Okay.
that's how that's why the liability it's a moving target.
Right. Understood. Thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it over to other members of council for questions or comments, but if you stay where you are, I'm sure they'd like to weigh in. Mr. Reynolds?
Yeah, just a couple comments. First is thank you for coming. Thank you for the administration having this conversation. I think that oftentimes, these type of conversations often fall on too many deaf ears as far as what the cost drivers are in the budget. And one thing it seems we talk about every year is, in November, December, like what point in the year are the different, decisions made, or the different things, the factors that affect that budget that comes to us, asking us to approve it or not. So I really appreciate this conversation here, which makes us and our job easier down the road, and also increases our responsibility as council members when people say, oh, what's going on with the budget, and so on and so forth, to try to find a way to explain some of these different issues here. The public pension, I mean, several of us up here are teachers or married to teachers. And, one time I figured it out as far as our contributions of 7.5%. And if you put that in for 30 or 35 years, I will roughly pay in 100, and I'm just making up a number here, estimate $140, $150, $160,000. But then due to those calculations over, if I live 20 years past retirement, that's like a $1.5 million aggregate payout. So then it becomes a math problem of how do you turn $150,000 over 35 years, but which you don't have all at the beginning as an investor, to $1.4 million over 20 years, which is not easy to do. And most municipalities have been unable to do it. And if you look across the state of Pennsylvania and you look at the state of the finances of most municipalities that are in Act 47 or Act 47 recovery or on the way to Act 47 watch or whatever, a lot of it has to do with this. You look at Allentown, we've talked a lot about Allentown selling their water and sewer system to help fund their pension, and that didn't even work because now they still have issues there. Pittsburgh, I believe, sold their parking garages, like whatever that was, 8-9 years ago, I think, to try to create $400-500 million for their pension fund, or that was the plan. And it's a situation where it is a big percentage of our budget. Question for you, and I understand if this is not something that fits into your knowledge. I think, and I forget if it was Mr. Evans or not, had said our $14.6 million payment is 18% of our budget. Is that comparable to what you see in other municipalities? I know you mentioned sometimes.
Would you have meant 18% of payroll?
Of the overall budget.
Or $78 million general fund budget.
Okay, so the pension contribution is that much? Yeah, is that including state aid, or is that the city's portion of the pension?
City's portion.
That's the city's portion. I have to think a little bit. That seems like a high number. I usually see things as a percentage of payroll in the double digits, but not as a percentage of total budget. But I will say that it's simply a function of what it means. To be 75, it means you're probably $40 million underfunded, and to get that paid plus all your current payouts and plus all the accrued benefit, that's the number.
Yeah.
That's what it costs to get caught up. And that's not, you're not trying to catch up a huge gap. You're trying to catch up something they would describe as moderately underfunded. They're expensive.
Yeah, and that goes to my other question is that, and Mr. Sivak, correct me if I'm wrong here, is so we find out in the summer before, so they do the valuation of January 1st, 2019. And that's what that slide set up there before?
But the actuary is working on that now. It's
Yeah.
kind of, so the 1/1/19 valuation is actually due to the state at the end of March of 2020.
Yeah, so then we find out like in the summer of 2020 what our MMO obligation will be for 2021 and 2022.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then that 73% number, when we, how do I say this? So then is that what the number is before we make our MMO obligation? Or is that coming along with the changing valuation as well? So like we got it in summer of 2018.
Mhm.
So then we're going to make the payment in 2019. We make the payment in 2020. Now, if we make those payments, and then we get a new one in summer of 2020, then
Mhm.
the 73% represents what part in that timeline?
But that's as of 1/1/17. So it's
Okay.
not factoring in the MMO payments of 18 and 19.
Okay. So then when we make the MMO payments of 18 and 19, how does that affect that 73%? Or is it more, does it more come down to the market and how all of the funds are?
More down to the market
Okay.
is the biggest cost factor.
If
Yeah.
you were able to hold the returns in the fund at 7.5%, okay, and eliminate that variable, then that 73% is of January 1/17. So it does not show the contribution made in calendar year 17, 18, or 19, which would be 3 more years of contributions, which theoretically on that 10-year amortization schedule, you would have got 3/10 of it nipped. But the other variables are what did the liabilities do? Did your people live longer than expected or less than expected? And then investment returns. And I think in this 2-year period, those investment returns, 2017 was a very good year, but 2018 was not. So you're going to have a 2-year time period in this valuation where the returns were below 7.5%.
That we will then get in the summer of 2020
Correct.
to factor into our MMO payment for 2021 and 2022.
Correct.
Okay. Then I guess my last point / question comment to Mr. Sivak and Mr. Evans is, do you have off the top of your head what our MMO, like the estimated MMO increases we've dealt with over the last like 3 or 4 times we've done this?
And I think that was on the slide that Mr. Evans.
Yeah.
But you could see the 1/1/17, they went up pretty significantly. I mean, you could see from 2010 to 20, while there's been increases, they've been a little more manageable. But as we know, with the 2019 budget, they went up 2.2 million.
Yeah. So like the 2012, 2013 went up like 3.5 million. Is that what that says there? And that's when we did the pension bond?
Correct. Yep. In 2014. And that was, now this is all MMOs, including PMRS. And that 2014 pension bond was strictly for PMRS.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think that slide right there, that shows those increases and shows over time those increases and just the budget pressures. And this will be the last point I make, Mr. Waldron, is that like when we get a budget, people oftentimes say like, why is it that we need to find more revenue every year, wherever it comes from, is because there are built-in increases in our budget before we even look at the budget for next year. When you're dealing with like the given facts that you can't change about a budget. And I know it's frustrating trying to explain it to people sometimes, is that we do the best we can. We try to find revenue where we can. We try to support those necessary revenues to necessarily deal with increases that are fixed. And it's not that we don't want to do it, because we absolutely do. It's why we want to take care of our employees, and especially the fact the majority of our personnel is public safety. But it's just a very real budget pressure that I don't think people on a big scale ever truly comprehend it. But it's certainly important for us to talk about as much as possible. Thank you, Mr. Waldron. Thank you, Mr. Burnett.
Dr. Van Wert?
Thank you very much. In my fairly rudimentary understanding of pensions, I think Mr. Reynolds hit on the two numbers that I kind of use as a framework for understanding the health of the city, and that would be the percentage of our budget that goes to funding the pensions. And in that line, I think the flux is really where. Not just that flux, but the flux in what our percentage is. So if we were dedicating 10%, 15 years ago, and we've steadily increased, or has it been fairly wobbly roller coaster ride? If there's a way to understand what that flux looks like as a percentage of our pension obligations as part of the general fund, I think that would be something. It's not going to change what you're doing, but I think it is a key indicator of the health of our city, and I would be interested in seeing what that looked like. The other one would be the 73%. And what does that look like? From what I understand, there are certain levels at which a city is considered stressed if they drop below the funding. And I may have misunderstood this, but it seemed like we're steadily making increases in adequately funding, or has that 73% number also fluxed over time?
It's fluxed over time. I think with the 1/115 valuation, because you had 2 good years of returns in there, I think we were actually at 78% funded with that valuation. And then when the 1/117 came out, it went down to 73. So it's gone up and down over the last 10 years.
Okay.
But about 80% is about as high as we've gotten.
I don't know where the appropriate time in the process, if it's during budget season or perhaps even before, so it's something that's more anticipated. But that type of data, I think, is very educational, particularly in like pie charts and graphs, so that we can actually see the change itself. If that would be possible, that'd be
Sure,
good.
we can do
Thank
that.
you. That's all I have.
No problem.
Mr. Cologne?
Thank you, President Waldron. And thanks again for coming out and going over everything. One of the questions I had for the administration, I remember a couple of years ago, I don't even think I was on council yet when Scott Shearer was talking about one of the biggest things to always keep an eye on is headcount and contract negotiations, salary increases, which in the long term are going to affect pensions. Because when we think of 2012, I immediately think, oh, that's 7 years ago already. But when we're talking about employees that are working a minimum of 20 years, I know we still have a ways to go. And then there's a lot of, contracts coming up in that time. Is it ever talked about at the bargaining table with our police and fire about changing from that 50% formula? Is that something that's been even come up at all?
You mean for the post 2012 hires or pre?
For the post with the new because that's negotiated in the contract, correct?
Correct.
So is that something that's either police or fire have asked to be revisited to increase that pension level?
In arbitration, yes. And we're still in that process.
And so is that something that an ongoing arbitration that we're waiting on?
We're
These
waiting on,
decisions to be made.
yes, we should have both decisions this year for police and fire,
Okay.
but we don't have them yet.
And that's one of the things that we're waiting to hear back on then about the retirement, the percentage for 50%.
Correct.
Or if it's going to increase. Thank you. I think that was my only question that hadn't been answered yet from anyone else's questions. Thank you, President Waldron.
Mr. Callahan?
Thank you, Mr. President. I've said this several times before, and I just wanted to reiterate it again that, there's only basically two ways that our city brings in money, and that's either through raising taxes or taking a piece of land somewhere in the city and increasing its value. So I think it's really important that everybody on council and future council members understand that when we are talking about economic development projects, we are either saying no to those, which means we are then increasing taxes on the residents of the city disproportionately because of the pension obligations that we have, the payroll obligations that we have, the police, fire, I think if you look at it, I don't think there's ever going to be a time when our obligations for the payroll and pension obligations are going to go down. I think they're always going to be slightly going up. So we either keep on raising taxes, or we do economic development, or we do a little bit of both. And that would be my preference, is that we try to, it's important that when we are presented with economic development projects throughout the year, that we keep an open eye on that there are also revenue streams for us. And I think it's very important that we don't get to the point where we keep on raising taxes on the residents of the city and start pricing people out of the market of living in the city of Bethlehem, because there are a lot of people and low and middle income individuals that are starting to feel a pinch with the higher taxes that have been coming in the last 15 and 20 years. It's getting very expensive to live in the city of Bethlehem. If you look at rents right now on the south side, a 2-bedroom, I know they're higher end rentals, $1,800 for a 2-bedroom, $1,200 for a 1-bedroom. And if we don't try to find a way to curtail the increases in taxes, because the owners of those properties aren't going to eat that cost. They're not. You know it and I know. So they're going to pass those costs on, the increased taxes, to the renter. We're going to get to a point where Bethlehem is going to become a place for elitists. And the lower income people and middle income people are going to be priced out of the city. So thank you.
Mr. Martell?
Thank you, President Waldron. Mr. Burnett, first of all, thank you for,
Yes.
obviously all your work over the last, I think you said 15 years and the presentation tonight. Many of my questions were asked and answered. I just have maybe one or two quick ones. And if I miss this, I apologize. The 75% funded, how is that calculated? Is that over, I think you were throwing around 10 year. I mean, clearly the payments are being made today.
So it's like you have a kid going to college,
Mhm.
you hope, and maybe that child is 13 years old. So Penn State's $25,000 a year. You know that in 5 years, you need $100,000 to put this kid through Penn State. So the actuary says, since he's 14 years old, and you're 4 years away, if you have $71,000, you're on track to being fully funded for his child's college education. So it's a interim snapshot that you're on schedule. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. But so is that taken into consideration? Does that then project out, or is it taken into consideration what we have today versus what?
It projects, first of all, it takes the employee, it takes that 4.5% assumed increase in payroll, which is a nasty number, but that's what they use. And they take that out 30 years, come up with a present value, which today is probably $200 million or some number, I don't know. And then they take that amount of money that's in the pension plan, they assume that 7.5% rate of return. They run that back out and come up with a present value. And they were able to then come up with a difference between the assets and the liabilities projected, both numbers projected out. And that's the deficit that is reflected by 73%.
So, and this goes back then, I think, to what you had said before with the MMO payments, where it doesn't take into consideration those MMO payments at all. It just takes into consideration, it assumes what you have in there now.
No, I think it assumes you're going to be making those contributions. It has some assumption for what those contributions are. It doesn't know what it is, but that's assuming you continue to make those contributions. It's always assuming you're going to make the required contribution amount. Now remember, the required contribution amount is the difference in investment performance. So once they say 7.5% investment performance, there's no real delta on performance on an assumption basis, but they do assume that there's state aid and so forth. So those numbers are in there.
Okay. So the 73% then, like functionally from a year to year budget, tells us that we can expect significant MMO payments.
Absolutely. I
And
mean, if you're going to run a $30-40 million payroll, you're going to expect, there's a thing in the actual report, it's called a normal cost. So take away all the variables, but they say if this employee base works 1 year and therefore accrues 1 year of additional service liability, that they call it a normal cost, that's just the base number, it probably costs you $4 or $5 million a year to have a pension plan for that 1 year of accrued service. Then they make adjustments to it for investment performance, longevity of lives, pay increases, and all the other whammies that go into it. But the normal cost is $4 or $5 million a year to have a $30-some million payroll with that benefit schedule.
So do we have, and I'm not sure if this is for you, Mr. Burnett, or for the administration, then do we have projections on what, I mean, we talked about 14.8 million being 8% of the general fund. Do we then have projections out? Is that a number that we expect to continue to grow? That's what I'm assuming based upon looking at
And
that.
based on what we believe will happen with the 1119 valuation, based on the investment performance in 18, it's going to go up again for 21 and 22. You know, hopefully not 2.2 million, but it will definitely go up.
So, and like based upon just quick, you know, the best guess, you're hoping for relief once the kind of 2012 crop comes through, but that will be, you know, 2032 ish.
Correct, because remember, you're not only looking at the actives, you have all the retirees that were under the old system too. So you have all the retirees plus pre-2012 hires.
Yeah.
So the post-2012 make up such a small portion still 7 years later because of all the retirees that are still under the old benefit structure.
So I guess what I'm saying is at this particular point, that 14.8% of the budget is expected to continue to grow with no.
I mean,
Flatlining or
it should
relief and
begin to
such.
plateau, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 valuations based on the new hires coming on board. And again, you know, we from time to time go to arbitration. That's assuming that those benefit levels don't get changed. Because remember, police and fire, it's binding arbitration. Whatever comes back is what the new contract is.
How do we handle, like I'm assuming on some level there's some degree of projections for what the MMO is going to be. And I know from what I understand, when I recall, the 2.2 was a number that surprised us to some degree. So I guess I'm wondering from from a year to year, is there planning for that MMO? We know it's coming. Do we do that? And also, you know, how, I guess the surprise came from the stock market dip that was unexpected.
Well, yeah, but the 2 biggest cost drivers for the 2.2 was the investment performance, which unfortunately, even in our 5-year model, you know, the actuary assumes that we're going to meet that 7.5% rate of return. So, you know, it's just the normal cost goes up, but it was between that and then, you know, they changed the rules where the IRS requires us to update mortality tables more often. And ours was a little bit behind. So that was a huge cost.
Which in 2020 would be then off the table because that will be baked into what.
Correct. I mean, they may be updated again, but it won't be as big of a jump, you know, because of, you know, pre-2019, municipalities used to have a decision, you know, they could decide, okay, we'll update the mortality tables or we wouldn't. And a lot wouldn't because of the impact to their budgets. They would stave it off, you know, but you're just really kicking the can down the road at that point.
Right. I suppose that's all the questions that I have for now. I won't reiterate what everybody said, but you know, clearly it's, like I said, I appreciate the presentation and obviously it's something that we're going to have further conversations going forward. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other comments from the administration?
I just, our summary slide, a lot of the points have been made. We've had parts of this discussion in different forms, whether it be, usually it comes up at budget time. So it's good to have, kind of bring everything together here to talk a little about how the board functions. And of course, having Frank here was a great insight. But 3 closing points with defined benefit pension programs. It's the performance of the stock market, most specifically the funds that drives the MMO. We do have great confidence in our pension fund advisor, and we hope that to continue. Second point is that the exponential growth that we've seen on that second slide that we actually went back to visit is clearly unsustainable. So from our point of view, it is critical that the 3 bargaining units understand the need to control components of the contract that drive up the pension costs, those variables. So it's our job to deliver and communicate that to the leadership, but also to the rank and file, because now it is split. There are people who come on since 2012, and this has happened in the teacher ranks as well, where they might look and say, well, people some chart a couple of years ago, they have a different system. Can we go back to have that? So we need to educate them to let them know the impact, why it does. And it's not like we just got stingy and didn't want to do it. It's had a, it's really getting pinched, and it's going to be a very, very tough future couple of years if something like that would go back to where it was. We're trying to work our way out of this. So we continue to communicate that to the leadership, and also during negotiations. It's a real big point, the idea of the pensions and what it is. There are different ways to compensate our employees. We want to compensate them fairly. We want to attract good employees. But the pension is a big one. And that goes on my third point. The city must continue to search for opportunities to outsource services and reduce full-time personnel in current pension programs. So when it's possible, if there's a service, there's a program that can be outsourced. And we listed some examples there where we might be able to have a third party do it, a private enterprise do it. And so in some areas we can't do that, because as a city and responsibilities that we have, they have to be held internally. But you can see the business privilege, if it's Tri-State Financial Group, if it's level one. At the golf course, we just went to seasonal employees versus the year round, and we're able to reduce the idea. Came up a couple of times, headcount, full-time headcount. And even when we started to talk about the development and design of our new website, rather than adding IT, we looked to outsource that, to have that done outside rather than adding personnel. It's just very, very expensive, and we all understand that. So we are taking what steps we can to hedge against this.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Is there any comments from members of the public? Mr. Shire?
Excuse me. Bill Shire, 1898 Avenue. I agree that we need to keep focused on affordable housing. But when we're talking about the tension between tax increases and economic development, there's a third factor at play there too, and that's quality of life. That also has a monetary value. I have a technical question, I think, from Mr. Burnett. If the performance in 1 year is above the 7.5%, is there a carry forward on that, or would you just have to keep doing 7.5% every time?
Well, do you have some background with this? Because that's a hard question. That if you really read the actuarial report and saw how they do these things, they take the investment return for 1 year, they average it for 3 years, and that's called a smoothing method. And so they use a smooth 3-year average rate of return when they do these numbers to keep the volatility of your pension contribution moderated. So you don't really feel the full impact of a bad year, especially if it's preceded by a good year and then followed up with a good year, because they take these 3-year averages. But at the end of the day, the 7.5% stays intact, because that's what this asset mix and this policy mix of stocks, bonds, and alternate investments is projected to return. And therefore, that number is a lock based on investment theory. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Did he pass the quiz?
Well, that's what I expected, but it's interesting about the moving average. Yeah. Well, okay. And statisticians call it a moving average, but never mind. About of course, it's very difficult to forecast the economy, but I want to make just a few comments, because I think it pertains to the 3 to 5 year range, which is, as you said, is not quite the relevant range there, but has an effect. Politics right now, of course, are driving the economy to a certain extent. And if there is a trade war with China, it's going to affect the economy. And no doubt about that. Imports will be more expensive, and the domestic production will pick up in some of these areas, but they're not as cheap as it was before, because that's why we were importing from China. So inflation will increase. A lot of things at play. Stock market generally likes inflation. So stock market prices will go up. You're going to get more pressure on raising wages. The adjustments, if the trade war continues, the adjustments are going to take some time to work their way through the economy. Some sectors will expand, some will contract. There's going to be some unemployment for a while. That won't be good for the stock market. The Fed was very limited right now in how it can stimulate the economy because interest rates are so low. We can't really make our deficits any bigger than they are now. So I think the short-term outlook and the medium term, meaning 3 to 5 years, is a little bit negative because this expansion is the longest one in history. And things can't go on forever. It's sort of a historical law. So I would think that it's not out of line for the pension board to consider moving a little bit more, keeping an ear to the ground in Washington, because this president has a tendency of going up to the brink and then pulling back. But keeping an ear to the ground in Washington and keeping an eye open on the possibility of moving a little bit of the assets into fixed income rather than out of the stock market. Just a thought. As you know, economic forecasting is very, very difficult, and that's why they put out what they call consensus forecasts. They get forecasts from 30 or more economists, and then they take the average, actually the median. And so for what it's worth, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shire. Are there any other public comments? Thank you. I'd like to thank Frank Burnett for coming out this evening. And this meeting is adjourned.